I'm Daniel Levine, and this is the Bio Report. We continue our holiday tradition by welcoming Stat News senior biotech writer Adam Feuerstein for our annual look back at the year that was in biotech and what's ahead for the industry with the JPMorgan Healthcare Conference and beyond in 2025. Feuerstein offers his view on finance and deal-making in 2024, new drug approvals, and his annual take on the best and worst CEOs of the year. We also discuss what Trump 2.0 may look like for the industry, changes coming to the FDA and other agencies, and what hot technologies to watch in the year ahead. And to our listeners, thanks for tuning in throughout the year. We wish you all a happy, healthy, and prosperous new year. Adam, thanks for joining us.
Danny, it's always a pleasure. Our once-a-year biotech conversation.
And it's always a fun way to wrap it up.
Yes, for sure.
Well, we are going to talk about the year that was in biotech, the upcoming JPMorgan Biotech Week, and what's ahead in 2025. But let's start with the year that was. We're coming off a few tough years for the sector. My sense is that people were upbeat about the prospects for 2024, a little more than what you often hear about people being cautiously optimistic. With the full benefit of hindsight, how did 2024 turn out overall?
I think it was a very sideways year is the way I think about it now. I think you're right in that if we kind of go all the way back to last fall, December, kind of heading into the new year, I think there was people were pretty upbeat, right? Because if you remember last fall, I should say fall 2023, we had a bunch of acquisitions, right? And there's nothing that excites people more than M&A, and so there were a lot of these deals that happened kind of October, November, that got everyone kind of very excited going into 2024, and also sort of hyped up this expectation that we were going to have a lot of deals in 2024, and then those deals did not happen, Danny. It was a very down year for M&A in many ways. So I think that sort of deflated the bubble a little bit. So yeah, kind of just a sideways year.
I'm a little gratified to hear you say that because I'm saying, geez, I'm being so negative, but it's when you start digging through what happened over the year, you do walk away with this feeling that this wasn't what a lot of folks were expecting, and it really was not that it was a bad year, but it wasn't a great year.
Well, I think it was always going to be a little bit of a challenging year because of the election, right? And there's always all that uncertainty. It gets sort of that you sort of throw on top of things, and then just sort of the other macro economic sort of factor, interest rates, and obviously that is so important to an industry like biotech, which relies so much on being able to raise money. The industry spends a lot of money, doesn't necessarily make a lot of money. At least a majority of the companies don't. So those kind of things weighed on the sector a lot.
If you thought the election made 2024 challenging, wait till you see what it does to 2025.
Yes, exactly.
Well, one of the surprises in 2024 for me was that the layoff trend of recent years continued and never quite exhausted itself. There was a steady list of biotech layoffs throughout the year, with the gene editing company Editas this month announcing plans to eliminate 65% of its staff. Eyeballing the fierce biotech layoff tractor, it looks like we're actually ahead of 2023. And these weren't just struggling startups, but big pharma companies and commercial biotechs. What do you make of that?
Again, I think it's just another reflection on what I said before. But being a sideways year and a tough year, in that, that cash becomes very important. If particularly for companies that are in earlier stages, having to preserve cash, make sure that they have enough runway to kind of get to wherever they need to get to, whether it's the next clinical trial. And so, yeah, I think, like you said, across the board, right? It wasn't just a bunch of early stage startups that had to, maybe get lean a little bit, but it was, all companies, and even some of the big pharma companies, as they sort of lose patent protection on their largest drugs, and they're thinking about how they have to preserve capital. So that, like you said, it never really went away. I mean, it seemed like there was a steady drumbeat throughout the year of companies that were, you saw a lot of press releases, corporate restructuring type press releases throughout the year.
You talked a bit about M&A. There really weren't a lot of deals that got past, there were a number of $1 billion to $5 billion acquisitions. I think there was only one over that mark, which was Nova Holdings' acquisition of the contract development and manufacturing organization, Catalent, for $16.5 billion.
Right.
We are facing this patent cliff, and you would expect to see a lot more deal activity. Was it that companies just didn't feel the need to push here, given how capital markets remain so difficult?
It's I don't know why. Like, that's a great question, right? Why didn't we see the deals that we thought? And that was certainly a storyline for 2024. And there's no one reason why we didn't see the deals that we thought we'd see. Could be, maybe concerns about the FTC. We had a chairperson at the FTC, Lena Khan, who sort of seems to be someone who had pharma in her sights, and perhaps that made some of the pharma companies a little gun shy about pulling the trigger on large deals. I think part of the problem, it's kind of this weird thing, right, where you have so much speculation and anticipation for M&A, that you had this phenomenon where companies that are sort of logically takeover targets, right? I think it was like Cytokinetics is probably a great example this year, or Viking Therapeutics, probably the two best examples in 2024 of companies where like everybody thought that they were going to get acquired. And so what happens when that, what happens? Those stocks get bid up, right? Because everybody wants in on, before a deal happens, and the stocks become very expensive. And maybe they become so expensive that whoever is looking at them says, well, gee, we're not going to pay that. If you tack on a 50% premium, let's say a minimum of a 50% premium onto whatever the market value of those companies is, those deals just become untenable. And I think there was some element of that this year, where maybe companies just sort of priced themselves out of being acquired.
Companies that were hoping for an exit, or at least their investors, they did have a better shot at an IPO this year. The IPO activity rebounded a bit, with about $3 billion raised in the first three quarters in a total of 16 deals. There have been a few additional debuts this quarter, but what do you make of the IPO market this year?
I think it's pretty lean. I mean, the fact that there were IPOs is probably maybe a positive sign, because I think it had been a very difficult thing to do. And, we've talked about this in the past, and, that there's just so many biotech companies out there. And consolidation has been kind of a theme over the last couple of years. I still think IPOs, it seems like it's a difficult task these days. One thing we saw a lot of this year was kind of reverse mergers. I think we saw probably, I don't have the numbers in my head, but, there seemed to definitely be a trend towards companies going public, kind of, if you think about it, sort of through the back door, right? Merging with public companies that are sort of, sitting there as kind of empty shells, versus, and that wasn't maybe an easier path to the market than going the sort of traditional IPO route.
There was still plenty of money to be made in biotech stocks this year, also plenty of money to be lost. One issue that's likely to happen, though, going forward, is the XBI is likely to be a lot less volatile because of a makeover this year. What did you make of the changes to the XBI, which shifted its weighting to larger cap stocks?
Yeah, I've heard a lot of complaints about the way that they changed the makeup of the XBI, and it's become, sort of, you used to think of the XBI as kind of the small to mid cap focused index, and sort of a good sort of barometer of the health of small and mid cap biotech stocks, versus maybe the IBB, which kind of more weighted to large caps. And now they're very similar, right? The XBI is it looks a lot more similar, heavily focused on sort of large caps. So I think it's as a benchmark, I think it became less useful for people. And again, a lot of complaints about it. You look at the performance. I mean, as we are talking here, Danny, the XBI is basically flat for the year. We were up sort of marginally, just a single-digit percents earlier this week. With the Fed decision earlier this week, that looks like maybe we'll only get a couple of rate cuts in 2025. There was an expectation, obviously, for more cuts. That sort of caused the market to tank, and now we'll see what happens through before the end of the year. But it right now, the XBI biotechs are significantly underperforming the broader market, and that's a trend that we've seen in recent years.
Another disappointment for the sector is that licensing deal upfront payments fell in 2024 to just 5% of total deal value. That's down from 13% in 2019, according to Dealform and JPMorgan's quarterly report. Is that a reflection of how difficult it was for companies to raise money? And they just seem to have little leverage at the bargaining table.
Yeah, well, that could be, that could be right. It's always hard. I always sort of find it hard to kind of decipher trends when it comes to license deals. Between upfront payments and milestone payments. What we like to call sort of the biobuck side of the equation. I think one of the interesting trends that we're seeing this year that I sort of picked up is we're seeing a lot of deals being done with Chinese biotech companies. That's still that's not a new trend. We've seen that increase over the last several years. But it sort of ties in a little bit to the sort of the M&A thesis too, because I think what we've seen, particularly, I can think of two deals that Merck did most recently, licensing drugs from China that were kind of the drugs that maybe people thought that Merck would make acquisitions of U.S.-based biotechs to address, right? But instead, they go over to China, and for a relatively small amount of money in terms of like upfronts, they were able to find drugs in China. You're seeing that a lot in obesity, where there are just a lot of companies in China who have obesity drugs, in all of sort of the hot targets over there that are ripe for licensing, and we've seen some of those deals. We've seen some of those drugs being acquired through licensing deals, or new companies, new obesity focused companies starting up here, where they go over and basically their pipeline is coming from China.
Well, what's interesting to me about that is that in these deals, China's the source of innovation, as opposed to being a deal driven by market access.
Yeah. Right. Exactly. Yeah. It is interesting that there are. And I think that's one of the reasons why a lot of people here who are sort of more U.S. focused or wonder like why U.S. based biotech companies haven't been acquired, and they see, well, gee, some of these pharma companies can, they have relationships with Chinese drug companies. I think some of the credibility issues that had been raised in years past about Chinese drugs and are they reliable? I think a lot of that stuff has sort of gone away, right? And so it's become a real source, like you said, it's become a real source of innovation for pharma.
My feeling about new drug approvals in 2024 is kind of along the same themes. There were some notable approvals: a new drug for schizophrenia, the first cell therapy for a solid tumor, and some other notable approvals. But it was a solid year of approvals, but we'll probably be down from last year. Anything particularly compelling in this class of new drugs?
I mean, to me, the sort of the most important, or maybe the best drug approval in 2024 was Cobenfy. That, as you mentioned, that is the new treatment for schizophrenia. The first new treatment for schizophrenia in 2 decades. A new way of treating the disease. I thought that was probably the most meaningful drug approval. But like you said, after that, it's kind of, I don't think there wasn't enough, like, there wasn't a lot of headline raising sort of approvals this year.
On that front, I thought one of the biggest stories about drugs was not an approval, but a withdrawal, which was Amylyx is pulling its ALS drug Relievio from the market. What did you think of that?
That yeah, I mean, it's funny. When I was thinking about that, I was like, wait a second, did that actually happen in 2024? And it did. Right? It was back in March and April, and it just seems like that was maybe like 10 years ago. But no, it was actually this year. Yeah, that was obviously a very unfortunate situation where the drug had been approved here, and based on some data that it was, I would, maybe controversial is not exactly the right word, but I think there was a lot of dispute about whether or not the drug should have been approved or not in terms of the strength of the data upon which it was approved. But at the same time, the company had been conducting this larger phase 3 study, which was going to give us a more definitive picture of the benefits and risks of the drug, and that study read out in March, and it was negative. It was, resoundingly negative. And, the company did, Amylyx, Josh Cohen and Justin Klee, the two co-CEOs of that company, they did the very, responsible thing, which was to withdraw the drug, voluntarily withdraw the drug from the market. Now, maybe the FDA would have stepped in anyway, but, they withdrew the drug from the market because it was clearly not benefiting patients or people living with ALS. So, that I actually, maybe we'll talk about, sort of my best and worst CEO candidates, but, they were on my list of best CEO candidates this year for what they did, because I thought they handled it with a lot of integrity.
Well, let's talk about that. There was actually no best CEO this year, although you did highlight several different CEOs for specific accomplishments, including Cohen and Klee, as you just mentioned. But do you care to discuss a few of the picks and why no best one?
Yeah, I think people are picking up the theme of this of our conversation, Danny, which is like 2024, meh, right? It's sort of a running theme to all the topics that we're talking about. And like your listeners probably know, every year I put together this sort of best and worst CEO list, biotech CEO, biopharma CEO list. And I had actually a really deep list of potential best CEOs this year, but there was no standout. Like, there was no one that was like, wow, that person deserves this award more than anyone else. So I kind of decided not to sort of name an individual, a single person, and just sort of look at it kind of as a group. Because I think that there were, like I said, I mentioned Josh Cohen and Justin Klee from Amylyx, and they were on there. I mentioned, we talked about Cobenfy, and so, Stephen Paul, who was the CEO of Karuna Therapeutics, which was the company that developed Cobenfy, and Chris Berner, who is the CEO of Bristol Myers, and Bristol Myers bought Karuna last year, so they're on the list. I've got folks like, I think there are a bunch of companies that did a really good job of selling drugs this year. I think we spent a lot of time with focusing on the development of drugs and the approvals, but then you got to actually sell it, right? And marketing drugs can be tough. And there were some companies that did well, like, Bill Siebold from Madrigal, who had, basically the first drug for MASH. And that was a drug that, kind of right out of the gate has done very well. And, sort of looking at the science stuff, I mean, one of the bigger stories this year was in the progressive heart disease that we know as ATTR-CM. One of the bigger clinical trial readouts came from Alnylam Pharmaceuticals this year with their ATTR-CM silencer, Amvuttra, and that that was successful, and that was a kind of a big story in 2024. So, Ivan
Not to mention Bridge Bio getting an approval
and
for
Bridge
that.
Bio and Bridge Bio got it. I was about to say, and Bridge Bio got an approval for their stabilizer drug, and that one of the interesting stories for next year will be to see how those two companies compete against each other in the market. But Ivan Greenstreet, CEO of Alnylam, was on my list.
This year's worst CEO you had less trouble nailing down.
Yes, that one
You
was
say
easy.
it was the easiest, most obvious selection ever made for the dishonor in 17 years. Who did you name and why?
Yeah, so this Remy Barbier, CEO of I should say former CEO, because he's no longer at the company, former CEO of Cassava Sciences, the company, that was probably the most argued over and, sort of embattled biotech stock, not only this year, but of the last several years, their Alzheimer's drug, which, I guess I was sort of on a crusade for a much of the year, for actually the last 4 years, about how this was not a drug that was going to help anybody with Alzheimer's, and Remy is on the list because of really just kind of the way that they just misled everybody about the data. We had just about everything with the Cassava story, right? We have we have their outside research consultant being being indicted by the DOJ. We had Remy and his wife, Lindsay Burns, who was the VP of neuroscience of the company. They were cited by the SEC. We had all kinds, just basically everything, every little bit of drama that you could imagine happened with Cassava. And, obviously the penultimate event happened in November when the phase 3 study that they were running failed miserably. And so, for all those reasons and more, Remy Barbier is the worst biopharma CEO of 2024. Congratulations, Remy.
We've been through another presidential election. The national security
Wait,
positions.
we have? Oh, that's right. There was an election this year. Thanks for reminding me, Danny.
Well, the national security positions have dominated the public discussion of Trump's picks for good reason, but that's limited the hair pulling around Robert Kennedy Jr. The industry seems to have been fairly quiet to date on the picks that will most affect it. Much has been made about Kennedy's vaccine skepticism, which I think is unfortunate because he seems to lack the credentials and experience to run HHS, and that doesn't seem to be getting a lot of attention. Are you hearing concern from the industry?
I think you're right. I think the industry is kind of taking a step back and not actively opposing RFK Jr. I have to credit our DC team. We have an incredible team of reporters who staff our DC office and who write about, obviously have been incredibly busy between the election and then all of the stuff that's happened afterwards. And from what they have been reporting, both the industry itself has really not come out, has kind of taken a very quiet stance and not tried to actively oppose RFK. But also, it seems like right now, when you look at least initially, I mean, this week, RFK is sort of making his way through Senate meetings with senators, in preparation for the confirmation hearing, and it doesn't seem like there's an opposition yet. I mean, obviously, some could surface in the next few weeks and after the inauguration, but right now, he seems to be on the glide path towards confirmation.
I think the industry is hoping he'll remove fluoride from the water supply and replace it with GLP-1s.
I think that people feel like, the conversations that I've had with people, I think the feeling is that it'll be fine if he sticks to the food stuff, kind of the MAHA, food, chronic illness stuff, and leaves kind of the drug side alone. Whether that impacts sort of vaccines, I think people are a little bit worried about that for obvious reasons, given his background. But from a drug perspective, you also have to think about Trump. He's a very pro-business guy, right? And so I think there's a hope that he's not going to do anything that really disrupts, one of the most important, business sectors in the country. So we'll have to see. And the same thing kind of goes with Marty Makary, who, is the FDA, the
Yeah, the biotech CEOs I speak to seem very comfortable with his pick. And I think there is this attitude that, well, this is a group of folks who don't like regulation, but are there things they should be worried about?
I think in terms of the FDA, I mean, I think I agree with you. Like, and the CEOs that I've spoken to and the investors that I've spoken to seem to be okay with Marty Makary. He, he sort of has made a name for himself as a little bit of iconoclast and someone willing to speak out about certain issues, particularly around the COVID vaccinations and sort of the COVID vaccine policies during the pandemic. But he is also somebody who seems to respect science. He's a pancreatic surgeon by trade, a scientist by profession. So I think that people feel like he's not someone who's going to necessarily make radical changes to the way the FDA does things, at least on the drug side. Vaccines will be interesting though, right? I mean, I think that will be to see sort of what happens on vaccines. I think there's a little bit more uncertainty there. And then I think the other issue that may be a little bit overlooked is just what this new administration and all the changes that will be put in place, what if impact, if any, that will have on FDA staffing. Like, will we see kind of the sort of the I don't call it the old guard, but like, the officials that are there, longtime FDA officials, will we start to see some of them leave the agency? I don't want to spend 4 years under Marty Makary and RFK Jr., so I'm out of here, kind of thing. Not only those people, but just sort of like the rank and file. And if there's a big disruption, the FDA always has staffing issues. And so I think there is some worry that may be exacerbated. And so we'll
Not
just have to
just
see.
trouble attracting staff and retaining staff, but looking at an administration that's keen on making very big cuts to government bureaucracies.
Yeah, right. I mean, we've got to think about the Doge brothers, right?
That's right.
Elon and Vivek. And so I think that they have, at least Vivek has sort of signaled to folks that, that you don't, they're not going to do anything that really, he obviously has a biotech background, and that he's not going to do anything that really sort of puts the drug industry in jeopardy. But again, it's so hard to know, right? Because right now we're all what we're doing these days is like parsing tweets or X posts and and other snippets of things, and it is difficult to kind of sort of figure out what might actually happen.
Well, you mentioned the policy towards vaccines a little uncertain, but one guy I do wonder about is whether Peter Marks will have a future at the Center for Biologics Evaluation and Research.
Yeah, that is an interesting one. I think he's somebody to watch. He has a little bit of a target on his back because of his involvement with the COVID vaccines, particularly sort of the approvals of kind of the boosters and the data under which those were approved. And so, yeah, that could come back. We'll see, how much of a big deal that is.
One part we didn't talk about was NIH. Jay Bhattacharya is Trump's pick to head NIH. He's a physician scientist and a senior fellow at the Stanford Institute for Economic Policy Research. He was a critic of COVID mandates, but what does having a health economist heading NIH mean for the direction of research?
Man, Danny, I knew you were going to ask me a question that I just don't know much about. Thankfully, I don't have to deal with the NIH. Most of the time, I'm much more down the road, right, and stuff. But I think just generally, I mean, I think there's worries. Again, it's the whole Great Barrington Declaration thing, and but I think there's also a recognition that maybe the NIH that reform is needed at the NIH in certain circles. So I guess I take a much more personally, I think I sort of take a more neutral stance on some of these things. I think always times where there's always these great fears of catastrophe ahead, and it just doesn't turn out that way. Um, this is a cop out answer for you. I'm sorry,
No.
but I think I'm much more kind of tuned into like the way things are going on at the FDA than I am at the NIH.
Let me shift gears. Atlas Ventures' Bruce Booth, in his annual year in review posted to YouTube, notes that GLP-1 producers Lilly and Novo had a $1 trillion gain in aggregate market cap over the past 3 years with their obesity drugs. He noted that they created more value in 3 years than the 700 IPOs since 2000 and the 300 M&A deals during that time, which together created just less than $1 trillion in value. Not surprisingly, obesity drugs remain hot. What do you see happening here?
I mean, it's the story. It's not only the story of 2024, it'll be the story of 2025, maybe 2026. Obesity it just dominated everything this year. It's got everyone's attention. I think it plays into kind of the sideways performance of the sector because, one thing that people have bemoaned for a long time is sort of the lack of a generalist investor participation in biotech. And it's just so much more easy to make money buying Nvidia and AI stocks and Bitcoin than why bog myself down in sort of the and all this biotech stuff that I don't understand. And if I want pharma exposure as a generalist investor, I just buy Lilly. Right? It's just easy to just buy more Lilly. And again, Lilly was the top performing pharma stock this year. There was a point this year where Lilly itself approached $1 trillion market value, right? We've never had a pharma company with $1 trillion market value. Lilly got pretty close this year.
It's kind of astounding to see it's Lilly, if you've covered this industry as long as you have, if you think about where Lilly generally ranked during most of your career on the list of big pharmas.
Yeah, but it's all right. It's Zepbound. It's obesity. It's those drugs are mega blockbusters. They will collectively next year, be the biggest selling drugs. That in terms of drug class, they are the biggest selling drug class. You think of like a drug like Keytruda for Merck, a $25 billion a year drug. Zepbound is going to pass that easily. And so that's what it's all about. And I think you're seeing it in everywhere. You're seeing it, in new companies, new obesity companies being formed. You mentioned Atlas, they've been involved in funding some new obesity companies. You've got, other publicly traded biotechs. We mentioned Viking being kind of front and center as a company that is developing its own obesity drugs. And so it's just, we joke about it on our podcast. Like we feel like every single week, we're talking about obesity. My colleague Elaine Chen, who is sort of our point person reporter covering obesity. It's unbelievable how much attention that that has gotten this year, and just it doesn't seem like there's any diminishment of that.
And it doesn't seem like it's just obesity. It looks like the things that were hot in the recent years continue to be hot, like antibody drug conjugates and AI. But what newer technologies are you watching in 2025? Is it going to be in vivo gene editing or molecular glues or protein degraders? What's catching your eyes?
Yeah, I mean, I think all those things are really interesting. Kind of RNA editing, sort of second generation, second and third generation genetic medicines, whether it's sort of base editing, prime editing. You mentioned in vivo. We've seen the two genetic medicines for sickle cell disease struggle to kind of to succeed commercially this year. That's kind of a big story for 2024, and we'll see what happens in 2025. But there are efforts underway to potentially do in vivo, in the body editing as a potentially curative treatment for sickle cell and other diseases. So I think that's something that's super interesting, and we'll watch. And you mentioned, ADCs, antibody drug conjugates are always popular. One of the bigger stories this year in other cancer was, kind of the bispecifics, and particularly, you saw the sort of the PD-1 slash VEGF drug from Summit and Akeso, the Chinese, again, another Chinese company, Akeso, who developed this PD-1 slash VEGF antibody that Summit Therapeutics licensed globally. That was a big story. And then you saw other companies sort of come in, and now there's sort of a glut of those kind of antibodies out there in development.
You see 2025 as any kind of a make or break year for any biotechs?
Looking at sickle cell, like I do sort of have my eyes on Bluebird Bio, which has been, a financially troubled company for a while now, has, done a decent job launching its sickle cell gene therapy, but, that's a really tough business. It's, it's expensive to manufacture and to market, and they're not making money, and the company's balance sheet is just wobbly. And so I look at that and I wonder, whether they can survive, even with, even with a drug, a curative therapy on the market. And then, what are the ramifications of, if they can't, what are the ramifications of that? I think that'll be something interesting to watch.
Are you going to be heading to San Francisco for JPMorgan this year?
Danny, I'm headed to San Francisco. Yes. And, this year is interesting, right? Because the calendar, we have a full week in January before we all fly out there. So, we might see a lot of news. Hopefully we'll see a lot of news that week of January 5th. Maybe there'll be a lot of news that week, sort of pre JPM. But yeah, I will be out there. The stat will be out there. We've got a full cohort of folks going to cover all things JPM week.
And anyone you're particularly interested in hearing from, anything that you're going to really look for to measure whether, this is going to be a good one for biotech?
I mean, my yardstick for that is always kind of around news flow, right? And sort of, so whether it's the week before, like I mentioned, whether it's that or January 5th week before we get out there, or the Monday of JPM, how much news do we see, the significance of that news? And then, of course, again, it often comes down to, M&A and deals, right? People, I think, were hoping to see a kind of an uptick in deals in December. It seems like it's kind of late for that now. I mean, we're getting up to, right, like we're right up against Christmas and Hanukkah week. So, maybe early January when we all come back, and, if there's if we see a bunch of deals get announced, again, that sentiment wise, right, that would shift things in a heartbeat, right? We'd have that's how I kind of judge. That's what I look for, to see whether it's like a successful JPM or not.
If you're a Stat News subscriber, you can have Adam delivered to your inbox every Thursday morning. Go to statnews.com and select newsletters from the upper right-hand navigation bar and select the Biotech scorecard. For those attending Biotech Week in San Francisco, Stat will be holding an event on Monday, January 13th from 6 to 9 p.m. To register, go to statnews.com and look under the Stat Events tab. It's a chance to not only hear from Perceptive Advisors Joe Edelman, American Enterprise Institute Scott Gottlieb, and Oracle Health and Life Sciences Seema Verma, but meet Stat reporters as well. Adam Feuerstein, senior writer for Stat and George Polk Award winner for medical reporting. Adam, thanks as always.
Danny, happy Hanukkah, Merry Christmas, and we'll see you out in San Francisco. Thanks again.
Thanks for listening. The Bio Report is a production of the Levine Media Group. To automatically download this podcast each week, subscribe to our RSS feed or through iTunes or other podcast manager. To join our mailing list, go to levinemediagroup.com. We'd love to hear from you. If you want to drop us a line or are interested in sponsoring this podcast, send email to danny@levinemediagroup.com. Special thanks to Jonah Levine, who composed our theme music, and the Jonah Levine Collective, which performs it.